And our final speaker, distinguished professor from University of Bologna, Marina Costerbosa, continuing on the topic of AI and ethics. Please, Marina.
Just a moment. Well, thank you very much for the presentation. And I'm very grateful to the University of Tallinn and to the people who concretely organized this conference so well. So thank you. And I'm very grateful to Professor Massimo Latorre and Indrek Grauber for inviting me to a so interesting and prestigious conference. The conference focused on the effects of the so-called digital revolution, of the latest advances in technological development. It invited us to discuss together, and now we are at the end of this meeting, from various disciplinary perspectives on the latest frontiers reached by the technological change of life functions, on the compulsive invention of new needs associated with it, on the multiple, sometimes disturbing applications of algorithmic deliberation, not least in the judicial field, in general, and potentially in the law-making processes too, or even on the serious unknowns linked to machine learning processes, some of which are constitutively uncontrollable. In particular, one wonders whether this scenario leads to the end of law and we might also add, to the end of morality. One wonders whether all this, on the one hand, confirms the superfluity of human decision-making, and on the other hand, makes it impossible, as mankind has in some way abdicated its moral responsibility. The theme, in its essence, of course, has been intuited and anticipated in its general and particularly dramatic implications by various thinkers of the 20th century, among others by a German philosopher, in particular, whose insights I believe can be valuable to revisit today in order to orient ourselves in a so transforming present time. The author I'm referring to is Günther Anders. As we know, Anders lived through the entire 20th century, from beginning to end, and wrote important texts on moral philosophy, philosophical anthropology, and on philosophy of technology, as himself chose to define the theoretical scope of his most important work. In a theoretical, not personal, alignment with some philosophers of the so-called Frankfurt School, Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno above all, Anders reflects on power, on its new conformation, specifically due to its relationship with technical scientific progress. The connection between science and power, which Günther Anders defined as Promethean, has led humankind to become aware of the fact that hence a metaphor of creativity, as already seen by Aristotle, are at the same time a source of ruin or salvation. The human being in contemporary times should acquire awareness that future of humanity lies precisely in his hands. The same metaphor returns in this key and not by chance in other Anders' writings. The constructive force of those hands coupled with the risk of becoming self-destructive, opens up the question of a knowledge and force that also belongs to the realm of domination. The de facto domination and the aspiration to dominate more and more corresponds to a science that transforms itself into technoscience, while nevertheless claiming to remain neutral from a moral point of view, a science that invokes for itself a ready-made alibi in the face of every possible inauspicious outcome. The two phenomena, technology and power, ally themselves, and the humankind, which is the source of both, risks of letting them slip away, losing itself. Cornelius Castoriadis also effectively portrayed this contradictory trait of technological progress. In 1987, in an article entitled "The Impossible Technocracy," he spoke of an impossible form of power, of a technocracy that is constitutively impossible, precisely because it is destined to self-negate and lead humanity to deny itself. Law is law and demands absolute obedience. Science is science and must go forward without reservation. These dogmas, rooted in the tradition of modern Western thought, were refuted in the 20th century by the violence of events. In this context, Anders' relevance to our theme, particularly the importance of his two volumes, entitled Die Antiquität des Menschen, lies in his radical analysis of contemporary technological society and his outlook toward the future. With good reasons, Anders is judged a pessimistic philosopher, a disparate figure who sees in progress a sequence of tragic errors, leading humanity to a tragic end, wherein technique and power, in their unhappy combination, will bring humanity to self-destruction. Yet, upon rereading his text, and, as I mentioned, without neglecting the second volume of the Obsolescence of Humankind, whose subtitle sounds Über die Zerstörung des Lebens im Zeitalter der dritten industriellen Revolution, one finds precious clues to a still possible hypothesis of change. It is not a hope of those yearning for regression, to halt or stop technological development. In his writing, the key opposition is not, as one might think, between artificial and natural, but between means and ends. The rationally possible solution, the redemption from the serious condition of reification in which human beings find themselves, surrendering to the ever-new and stronger blows inflicted by technology, does not consist in a return to the past, in an absolute rejection of technology. Rather, it lies in understanding the crucial matter, the willingness to servitude of human beings, the renunciation of being ends in themselves and not merely means. In short, the problem to be overcome is not the creation of artificial means, but having elevated them to ends, having inverted the positions, what was the end, humanity, has been downgraded to a means, and what was born as a means is now an end in itself. The game we are playing is an irrational one. Anders is certainly not the first nor the only one to grasp this decisive fact of the technological world in which we live. but his analysis is valuable. Contemporary society has become an expansive society in terms of power and the conscious removal of responsibility, confirming Horkheimer's thesis that civilization is to be understood as rationalized irrationality. And another philosopher who has a crucial role here, Hans Jonas, observes, the question is, can we manage to dominate the technique we ourselves have created? In technical development, which is driven by the opening new paths in certain directions, there is a sort of dynamic so that one's free choice is taken out of one's hands. In The Sorcerer's Apprentice, Goethe expresses it in a perfect way. Of the spirits I called, I can no longer free myself. This is Jonas' quotation. Responsibility is the complementary side of power, in the sense that it must be able to be, and in order for this to happen, it is necessary to make reflection we had no need to make before. In one of her essays on Aristotle, collected in the book The Fragility of Goodness, even Martha Nussbaum betrays concern when she observes that in our anxiety to grasp and control disorder with techne, we can easily stray away from the life we originally wished to control. I would like now to return to Günther Anders, because his reaction to this state of affairs appears promising. It may seem paradoxical because, as I mentioned earlier, he is traditionally regarded as a chronic pessimist, an apocalyptic philosopher without appeal. He himself was aware of this, so much so that he recounted that at a conference he had attended, he was accused of being a reactionary saboteur. He was also called a ridiculous saboteur of machines for the very fact that he had raised criticism of machines. He was even labeled as a romantic reactionary, and this is because criticism is eo ipso sabotage of progress and therefore precisely reactionary, while being an obtusely obstinate assertion of the human condition would render him an anachronistic romantic. For Anders, on the other hand, critique means civil courage, which allows us to ask what technology has done, is doing, and will do to us. Anders, therefore, gives us something relevant to think about, and this despite the fact that he remains one of the most bitter enemies of technological progress, to the extent of coining the expression technological totalitarianism in his text and saying, in the extreme form of domination, the most destructive and devastating expression of power. Anders was not a reactionary saboteur, nor an enemy of scientific progress as such, nor an advocate of the recovery of what is natural against the artificial construction of contemporary society destined for an apocalyptic end. The Andersian invective against the technocracy does not lead to the uncritical exaltation of the past, nor of what is by nature, which might even contain an internal contradiction, but rather to the defense of reflection and the exercise of imagination, the need to reinforce that awareness of what is at stake, the values at stake, and the capacities that can be lost by playing this game. no regress, rather reasonable progress as an ideal to strive for. No rejection of technology in the name of an implausible naturalistic ideal, but rather the wise control of human progress once we have recovered our lost imagination, which also means the ability to see and foresee in the long term the consequences of one's actions and decisions. A bit like a good chess player who has to read the chessboard by imaging a lengthy sequence of his own and others' moves. A fundamental element of Anders' critique of progress is represented by the concepts of Promethean shame and Promethean gap. Promethean shame is a shame that is felt at the humiliating height of quality of self-made objects. The fundamental stain of those who are ashamed is the origin, which generates the shame of having become instead of having been made, or owing one's existence. Unlike the perfectly and calculatedly designed products down to the last detail, and is thus related to the blind, uncalculated, and antiquated process of procreation and birth. The Promethean attitude leads us to overstep our limits, extending our power. Promethean for Anders is that difference manifested as a fundamental gap, that is, that gap that exists between our Promethean performance, between the products we, the children of Prometheus, produce and all other performances. The fact that we do not live up to the Prometheus within us. The original notion serves not so much to condemn, but to understand the current condition, to grasp the dynamics of production in technological society from an internal perspective. This paradoxical shame suggests that feeling of envy that humankind today feels when faced with the object it has produced, a feeling of humiliation at the gap that separates it from that object. To this tangible sign of progress, the human being consigns all value, thus concentrating everything in the mere instrumental dimension of acting, doing, and manufacturing. What matters is the usability and full accessibility of what exists in the world. Man now perceives himself differently. His perception of himself is one insuperable inferiority compared to what he has created. What is mortifying is the immeasurable distance that separates us from our self-made objects. The human being has been reduced to thinking of himself as a court dwarf of his own machine park. In the passage just quoted, Anders speaks of the loss of the random character of the process that has led us today. What he sees as exacerbating is a misunderstanding of the value of the blind, uncalculated, and antiquated process of procreation and birth. There arises the exaltation of design, of an engineering look to the human condition, motivated by the need to correct a natural defect, that of its uniqueness. The non-full usability of human beings and of the natural world, residue that always seems to give itself away, represents a defect, a disvalue. For Anders, the problem does not arise because a natural process is opposed and ideally replaced, but because the reason behind such an undertaking the intention behind it. Its denunciation lies in the fact that we transform ourselves for the sake of our machines, because we take machines as the model for our alterations. Thus, we renounce taking ourselves as the unit of measure and thereby limit our freedom or renounce it. The hubris that Anders criticizes now consists in self-limitation, in self-disorientation, in self-reduction to homo machina or homo materia. The problem does not stem from the progressive or artificial dimension of human action and its evolution. Anders does not yearn for preservation and immobility. The problem lies in the method and quality of this transformation. It is a development that transforms, denying and betraying the very idea of humanity. Against all possible realist or naturalist misunderstandings, for Anders, what is not obligatory. And the internal tension of progress becomes dramatic for him because it is an uncritical tension to the superhuman, which is in itself dehumanizing. Quotation by Anders. But make no mistake, Anders himself emphasizes, it is not the alteration as such that seems unheard of to us. Those who think they hear in our arguments, in his argument, the hidden voice of a metaphysical conservative miss the point. What is at stake is not metaphysical, but ethical. Misunderstanding with misunderstanding, blindness within blindness, is the assumption that a generation still exposed to randomness is a generation that emphasizes meaninglessness. Randomness is, on the contrary, for Anders, a guarantee of freedom, openness in planning, and an opportunity to search for meaning for oneself. And it is the question of meaning instead that is senseless. And it is absurd to seek the answer in the means-end dialectic when the means-end relationship has been reversed. No longer does the identification of means for the ends characterize human action. The very construction of means coincides with the end. It is already a long time since the degenerative process of the conceptual per means end was being prepared. Whatever the stages of this process may have been, means and end have today even exchanged roles. The manufacturing of means has become the purpose of our existence, and quantity has already changed into quality. Against this background, then, our initial question returns. What does it mean to be critical of technical scientific progress depicted in this way? Does criticism rise a wall and necessarily advocate the rejection of the artificial world? The mission under criticism consists in attempting to find new forces through awareness of the possibility of self-destruction and new courage, the courage to be afraid. After all, blind faith in progress is for him an eloquent removal, whose roots trace back to the rationalistic triumph of the 18th century. The germinal alteration of the humankind, the all-pervasive programming of social reality, the predictability of human action are not to be condemned and opposed as artificial. They are to be feared insofar as they induce a decisive loss, that of the randomness and unpredictability of the human condition, of its being inevitably exposed to chance, to randomness, and hence to creativity, the latter being decisive features of the identity of every human being. In conclusion, this applies not because they are natural, but because they are the ultimate guarantee of independence and the safeguard of the ethical perception that humankind must be able to continue to have of itself. Thank you.